My name is Detective Mike Sullivan, and I've been working homicide for the Chicago Police Department for 23 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything. Gang violence, domestic disputes, gone wrong, robbery, murders, you name it, I've worked it. But the case I'm about to tell you about, it changed everything I thought I knew about human nature. It was a cold Tuesday morning in November when we got the call. Dispatch crackled through my radio at 6:47 a.m. Unit 47, we have a possible homicide at 1247 Maple Street, Lincoln Park area. Victim is a 34-year-old female, apparent gunshot wound. I grabbed my coffee, threw on my coat, and headed out into the Chicago wind. The house was one of those beautiful Victorian homes that Lincoln Park is famous for, 3 stories. Painted blue with white trim, probably worth close to $1 million. But money doesn't protect you from evil, as I've learned over the years. The front yard was already cordoned off with yellow tape, and I could see my partner, Detective Rosa Martinez, talking to the first responding officers. "What do we got, Rosa?" I asked as I ducked under the tape. Victim's name is Sarah Chen, 34, works as a marketing executive downtown. Neighbor called it in around 6 a.m. when she noticed the front door was wide open. Single gunshot to the chest, close range, no signs of forced entry. I nodded, pulling on my latex gloves. Any witnesses? None so far. The neighbors say they didn't hear anything unusual last night. But you know how it is with these old houses, thick walls, and everyone minds their own business. We walked up the front steps and into what should have been Sarah Chun's sanctuary. Instead, it was now a crime scene. The victim was lying in her living room, still in her pajamas, light blue with little clouds on them. She looked peaceful, almost like she was sleeping, except for the dark stain spreading across her chest. Coroner's preliminary says time of death was between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. Rosa continued, consulting her notes. No defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. Whoever did this, she either knew them or they surprised her. I crouched down next to the body, careful not to disturb anything. That's when I noticed something that would haunt me for months to come. Clutched in Sarah's left hand was a small piece of paper, folded neatly in half. "Rosa, you see this?" She knelt beside me. "What is it?" Using my pen, I carefully extracted the paper from Sarah's fingers. It was cream-colored. Stationery, the kind you might use for wedding invitations or formal correspondence. I unfolded it slowly, and what I read made my blood run cold. In neat, careful handwriting, the note read, "For Emma, I'm sorry it had to be this way. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. Look in the place where we used to hide our treasures. The truth is waiting for you." Rosa and I exchanged glances. "This isn't for us," I said quietly. "No," she agreed. "This is for someone named Emma, back at the precinct." I sat in the fluorescent-lit conference room, staring at that note for what felt like hours. In my experience, killers who leave notes usually want to taunt the police, claim responsibility, or send some kind of message to the media. But this was personal, intimate even. "So who's Emma?" Rosa asked, settling into the chair across from me with 2 cups of coffee that looked like they'd been sitting on the burner since yesterday. "That's what we need to find out." I pulled out the case file we'd started building. "Let's go through Sarah Chen's life with a fine-tooth comb. Phone records, social media, work contacts, family, friends, everything." The first thing we discovered was that Sarah Chen lived a pretty ordinary life. She worked at a marketing firm downtown, had been there for 6 years, well liked by her colleagues. No romantic relationships that anyone knew about, though her co-workers mentioned she'd been dating someone casually over the summer. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. She volunteered at a local animal shelter on weekends and took yoga classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Doesn't exactly scream murder victim, Rosa observed, flipping through the preliminary background check. No, it doesn't, which makes this even more puzzling. I tapped the evidence bag containing the note. This M person, they knew her well enough to know about some shared hiding place, some treasures they used to hide together. That suggests a long-term relationship of some kind. We started with Sarah's phone records. The last call she'd made was to her mother in San Francisco at 8:30 p.m. The night she died, a routine check-in call that lasted 12 minutes. Before that, a few text messages with co-workers about a project deadline, and a call to her dentist's office to confirm an appointment. Nothing suspicious. Her social media presence was minimal. A Facebook account she rarely used, an Instagram with photos of her cat, Mr. Whiskers, and the occasional sunset or coffee shop visit. No mentions of anyone named Emma, and no one with the initial M appearing regularly in her posts or comments. What about family? I asked Rosa, who was working her way through Sarah's emergency contacts. Parents are David and Linda Chen, both retired, living in San Francisco. One brother, James, lives in Seattle with his wife and 2 kids. I called them all this morning. They're devastated, obviously, but none of them know anyone named Emma. And when I asked about someone with the initial M, who might have been significant in Sarah's life, they came up blank. That's when we decided to take a closer look at Sarah's house. Sometimes the answers you're looking for are hiding in plain sight. Asterisk the next morning. Rosa and I returned to 1247 Maple Street with a search warrant and a crime scene tech named Danny, who had an eye for details that most people miss. The house felt different in the daylight, less ominous, more sad. This had been someone's home, filled with their hopes and dreams and daily routines. All right, I said, pulling on fresh gloves. The note mentioned a place where we used to hide our treasures. That suggests somewhere special, somewhere meaningful to both Sarah and this Emma person. We started in the obvious places. Bedroom closets, under the bed, behind books on the shelves. Danny was methodically photographing everything while Rosa and I searched. The house was neat, organized. Sarah Chen had been the type of person who made her bed every morning and kept her spice rack alphabetized. It was in the basement that we found the first clue. The basement had been converted into a home office and craft room. There was a desk with a computer, some filing cabinets, and along one wall, a series of built-in shelves filled with art supplies, photo albums, and what looked like memory boxes. Mike, come look at this, Rosa called from the far corner of the room. She was kneeling in front of a section of the built-in shelving that looked slightly different from the rest. The wood was the same, but the spacing seemed off, like there might be a hidden compartment behind it. Danny came over with his flashlight and examined the area carefully. There's definitely something here, he said, running his fingers along the edges. Look at these scratches in the wood. Someone's been opening and closing this regularly. After a few minutes of careful probing, we found the mechanism. A small section of the shelf could be pushed in and then slid to the side, revealing a hidden compartment about the size of a shoebox. Inside, we found what could only be described as a time capsule. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing Sarah, Chen, and another young woman at various ages. As children, maybe 8 or 9 years old, playing in what looked like the same basement we were standing in. As teenagers, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at school events and birthday parties. As young adults, graduation photos, vacation pictures, candid shots of them laughing and making faces at the camera. The other woman in the photos was blonde, petite, with bright green eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Written on the back of many of the photos, in the same neat handwriting we'd seen on the note, were captions: Emma and Sarah, best friends forever. Summer 2003, our last sleepover before college. Emma's 21st birthday, she made me promise to never let her drink tequila again. So Sarah and Emma grew up together, Rosa said, carefully examining the photographs. This must have been their secret hiding place when they were kids. But there was more in the compartment. Friendship bracelets made of embroidery floss, movie ticket stubs, a small diary with a lock that had been broken long ago. And at the very bottom, a manila envelope that felt heavy in my hands. Inside the envelope were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Sarah, all signed with the initial M. But as I read through them, it became clear that M wasn't just any friend. These were love letters. I've read a lot of disturbing things in my line of work, but sitting in that basement, reading through those letters, I felt like I was intruding on something sacred. These weren't just love letters, they were the chronicle of a relationship that had spanned decades, filled with passion, heartbreak, and secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. The earliest letter was dated 15 years ago, when Sarah would have been 19. My dearest Sarah, I know we promised we'd never talk about what happened last summer, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you. I know it's complicated. I know there are a million reasons why we can't be together the way I want us to be, but I had to tell you how I feel. You're not just my best friend, you're the love of my life. I hope someday we can find a way to make this work. All my love, M. The letters continued chronologically, painting a picture of a secret relationship that had lasted for years. M, who we now knew was Emma, had been in love with Sarah since they were teenagers. But it was clear from the letters that their relationship was complicated, hidden, fraught with obstacles that went beyond the typical challenges of young love. Look at this one, Rosa said, holding up a letter dated 8 years ago. Emma talks about the family situation and how she can't risk them finding out. And here she mentions something about the inheritance and how she can't lose everything for love. As we read further, a picture began to emerge. Emma came from a wealthy, conservative family who had very specific expectations for her life. The letters made references to an arranged engagement, family, business obligations, and the constant pressure to maintain appearances. Sarah, it seemed, had been her escape, her secret, her true love that she could never publicly acknowledge. But the most disturbing letter was one of the most recent, dated just 3 months before Sarah's murder. Sarah, I can't do this anymore. The guilt is eating me alive. Richard suspects something. He's been asking questions, going through my things. I think he knows about us. I'm scared of what he might do if he finds out the truth. Maybe it would be better if we stopped seeing each other, at least until things calm down. I know this isn't what you want to hear, but I'm trying to protect both of us. I love you more than life itself, but love isn't always enough. Richard, I said, looking up at Rosa. That's a new name. Rosa was already pulling out her phone. I'm calling the precinct. We need to run a search on Emma's full name and find out who Richard is. It took our research team less than an hour to identify Emma. Emma Margaret Whitfield, 33 years old, daughter of prominent Chicago businessman Charles Whitfield, who owned a chain of luxury hotels throughout the Midwest. Emma was married to Richard Blackwood, a successful attorney who specialized in corporate law and had political aspirations. The Whitfield family was old money, the kind of people who appeared in the society pages and donated wings to hospitals. Emma's marriage to Richard had been front-page news in the Chicago Tribune's lifestyle section 2 years ago. A lavish affair at the Drake Hotel with 500 guests and a reception that reportedly cost more than most people's houses. "So Emma Whitfield is living a lie," Rosa said as we drove back to the precinct. "Married to a man she doesn't love, hiding her true relationship with Sarah Chen. And now Sarah's dead," I added grimly. "The question is, did Emma kill her too? Protect her secret? Or did someone else find out about their relationship and decide to eliminate the problem?" The Whitfield estate was exactly what you'd expect from old Chicago money. A sprawling mansion in Lake Forest with manicured grounds, a circular driveway, and the kind of understated elegance that screams wealth without being flashy about it. Rosa and I had called ahead, and Charles Whitfield had agreed to see us, though his tone on the phone suggested he wasn't particularly happy about it. A housekeeper in a crisp uniform answered the door and led us through a foyer that was bigger than my entire apartment. The walls were lined with oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors, and I could smell the faint scent of expensive cigars and old leather. Charles Whitfield was waiting for us in what he called his study, a room that looked like it belonged in an English manor house, complete with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive mahogany desk. He was a man in his early 60s, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. "Detectives," he said, standing to shake our hands. His grip was firm, his smile polite but cold. "I understand you're investigating a murder. I can't imagine how this could possibly involve my family." "Mr. Whitfield," I began carefully, "we're investigating the death of Sarah Chen. We have reason to believe your daughter Emma knew the victim." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or recognition, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name," he said smoothly, "and I'm quite certain Emma doesn't either. She moves in very specific social circles. Detective, marketing executives aren't typically part of our world." Rosa leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Whitfield, we found evidence that suggests your daughter and Sarah Chen had a long-term relationship. We'd like to speak with Emma directly." Now there was no mistaking his reaction. Charles Whitfield's face went pale, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, the polite facade slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. "My daughter is not available for questioning," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. She's been unwell recently, under a doctor's care. I'm afraid any stress could be detrimental to her condition." "What kind of condition?" I asked. "That's private medical information, Detective. I'm sure you understand." Rosa and I exchanged glances. In my experience, when wealthy people start talking about privacy and medical conditions, they're usually hiding something. "Mr. Whitfield," I said, "this is a murder investigation. We're going to need to speak with your daughter, whether that's here, at the precinct, or through her attorney. But we are going to speak with her." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he walked over to his desk and picked up an ornate telephone. Margaret, he said into the receiver. Please ask Emma to join us in the study. Yes, now. While we waited, Charles Whitfield poured himself a scotch from a crystal decanter on a side table. He didn't offer us any, which was fine by me. I never drink on duty, and something about this man made me want to keep all my wits about me. Detective Sullivan, he said finally, before my daughter arrives, I want you to understand something. The Whitfield family has been part of this community for over a century. We've built hospitals, funded scholarships, created thousands of jobs. We are not the kind of people who get involved in sordid situations. Murder isn't sordid, Mr. Whitfield, Rosa said quietly. It's evil, and evil doesn't care how much money you have or what your last name is. Before he could respond, the study door opened and Emma Whitfield walked in. Asterisk the woman who entered. The study bore little resemblance to the vibrant, laughing girl in the photographs we'd found in Sarah's basement. Emma Whitfield was thin, too thin, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes that no amount of expensive makeup could hide. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a simple black dress that hung loosely on her frame, but it was her eyes that told the real story. They were the same bright green eyes seen in the photos, but now they were filled with a pain so deep it was almost physical to look at. Emma, her father said, his voice gentler than it had been with us. These detectives want to ask you some questions about someone named Sarah Chen. At the mention of Sarah's name, Emma's composure cracked. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she made a small, wounded sound that went straight to my heart. In that moment, I knew we were looking at a woman who was grieving, not a cold-blooded killer. Mrs. Blackwood, I said softly, I'm Detective Sullivan, and this is Detective Martinez. We're very sorry for your loss. Emma's father looked sharply at me. Loss? What loss? I told you, we don't know, Daddy. Please, Emma whispered. And there was so much exhaustion in her voice that Charles Whitfield fell silent immediately. She walked slowly to one of the leather chairs facing the desk and sat down carefully, like someone who was afraid she might break. How did she die? She asked, looking directly at me. She was shot, I said gently. It would have been quick. She wouldn't have suffered. Emma closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. When? Tuesday night, sometime between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. I was here, she said immediately. I had dinner with my father and stepmother, and then I went to bed early. I haven't been sleeping well lately. Emma, Rosa said carefully, we found a note at the crime scene. It was addressed to you, signed with the initial M. Can you tell us about that? Emma's eyes flew open, and she looked at her father with something that might have been panic. What did it say? I pulled out a copy of the note and read it aloud. For Emma, I'm sorry it had to be this way. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. Look in the place where we used to hide our treasures. The truth is waiting for you. The effect on Emma was immediate and devastating. She doubled over as if she'd been punched in the stomach, and a sob escaped her lips that was so raw, so full of anguish, that even Charles Whitfield looked shaken. She knew, Emma whispered. Oh God, she knew. Knew what? I asked. Emma looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. That someone was going to kill her. That's why she left the note. She was trying to warn me, to tell me where to find the evidence. Evidence? Of what, Emma? Don't say another word, Charles Whitfield commanded, but his daughter ignored him. Evidence of who killed her, Emma said, her voice growing stronger. And why? She stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured grounds. Sarah and I grew up together. We were best friends, and then we were more than that. We've been in love since we were 16 years old, Emma." Her father barked, but she continued as if he hadn't spoken. "I got married because I had to, because of the family business, because of expectations, because I was a coward who couldn't face the truth about who I really am. But Sarah and I never stopped seeing each other. We couldn't. She was the only real thing in my life." Rosa leaned forward. "Emma, who else knew about your relationship with Sarah?" Emma turned back to face us, and I saw something new in her expression, fear. "My husband," she said quietly. "Richard found out 3 months ago. He's been making threats ever since." After our conversation with Emma, Rosa and I drove straight back to the precinct to dig deeper into Richard Blackwood's background. What we found painted a picture of a man who was used to getting what he wanted and didn't handle disappointment well. Richard Blackwood, 38, had graduated from Northwestern Law School and worked his way up to partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. He specialized in corporate mergers and acquisitions, the kind of high-stakes deals that could make or break companies. His clients included several Fortune 500 companies, and his annual income was well into 7 figures. But it was his personal history that caught our attention. "Look at this," Rosa said, pointing to her computer screen. 3 years ago, Richard was arrested for assault. The charges were dropped, but the police report makes for interesting reading. I leaned over to read the report. Richard had been at a business dinner when he'd overheard another attorney making what he considered disparaging remarks about his legal skills. According to witnesses, Richard had grabbed the man by the throat and slammed him against a wall, threatening to destroy his career and his life if he ever spoke about him again. Anger management issues, I observed. What else? His first marriage ended badly, Rosa continued, pulling up divorce records. His ex-wife filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. But if you read between the lines in the court documents, there are hints of controlling behavior. She got a restraining order that was later dropped as part of the settlement. "So we've got a pattern of violence and control issues," I said. "And now he finds out his wife has been having an affair with another woman for years. That's got to be a blow to his ego on multiple levels." We decided to pay Richard Blackwood a visit at his law office. The building was one of those gleaming downtown towers that scream success and power. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors, and Richard's office was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of Lake Michigan. Richard Blackwood was exactly what I'd expected, tall, handsome in a polished way, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I make in a month. But there was something cold about him, something calculating in the way he assessed us as we walked into his office. "Detectives," he said, standing to shake our hands. "I understand you wanted to speak with me about some kind of investigation." "We're investigating the murder of Sarah Chen," I said, watching his face carefully for any reaction. If I'd been expecting surprise or shock, I was disappointed. Richard's expression didn't change at all. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name, really," Rosa said, "because we have reason to believe she was having a relationship with your wife." Now we got a reaction. Richard's jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists on his desk. "My wife has been going through a difficult time lately. She's been seeing a therapist for depression and anxiety. Sometimes people in that condition, they imagine things, create fantasies to escape from reality." "So you're saying Emma imagined her relationship with Sarah Chen?" "I'm saying my wife is not well, detective. She needs help, not harassment. From the police, I pulled out one of the photographs we'd found in Sarah's basement, one that clearly showed Emma and Sarah as adults, embracing and laughing at what looked like a restaurant. "Does this look like imagination to you, Mr. Blackwood?" Richard stared at the photograph for a long moment, and I watched as his carefully controlled facade began to crack. His face flushed red, and a vein in his temple started to throb. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "From Sarah Chun's house. There were dozens of them, spanning years. Love letters too, signed by Emma." Richard stood up abruptly and walked to his window, his back to us. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with a cold rage that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Do you have any idea what this could do to my career, to my reputation? I'm being considered for a federal judgeship, detective. Can't have my wife's perversions becoming public knowledge." "So you knew about the relationship," Rosa said. Richard turned back to face us, and the mask was completely off now. "Of course, I knew. I hired a private investigator 3 months ago when Emma started acting strangely, staying out late, being secretive about her phone calls. I thought she was having an affair with another man. Finding out it was a woman was ... unexpected." "What did you do when you found out?" I asked. "I confronted Emma, obviously. Told her it had to stop immediately. I gave her a choice: end the relationship and get therapy to fix whatever was wrong with her, or I'd divorce her and make sure everyone knew exactly why." "And what was her response?" Richard's smile was cold and cruel. "She chose Sarah Chen over me. Said she'd rather lose everything than give up her true love." He practically spat the words. "So I decided to make the choice for her." The way he said it made my blood run cold. "What do you mean by that, Mr. Blackwood?" But Richard seemed to realize he'd said too much. The lawyer in him kicked in, and his expression became carefully neutral again. "I mean, I decided to file for divorce," he said smoothly. "I've already retained counsel. Emma can have her perverted little relationship if she wants, but she won't be doing it as my wife." Something about Richard Blackwood's story didn't sit right with me. His reaction to finding out about Emma's relationship seemed too controlled, too calculated. In my experience, when someone discovers their spouse is having an affair, the response is usually more emotional: anger, hurt, betrayal. Richard's response felt more like a business decision than a personal one. That's when I remembered he'd mentioned hiring a private investigator. Rosa and I decided to track down this pie and see what else he might have uncovered. It took some digging, but we eventually found him. Marcus Webb, a former Chicago PD detective who'd gone private after taking early retirement 5 years ago. His office was in a strip mall on the north side, squeezed between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect someone like Richard Blackwood to frequent. But sometimes the best investigators work out of the least impressive offices. Marcus Webb was a big man, probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from years of dealing with humanity's darker side. His office was small and cluttered, but I could see the organized mind behind the chaos case files stacked neatly. A wall covered with photos and timelines, the tools of someone who made his living uncovering other people's secrets. "Detectives," he said, standing to shake our hands. "I heard about the Chen murder on the news. Figured someone would be coming to talk to me eventually. So you know why we're here," Rosa said. "Richard Blackwood hired me to follow his wife. I spent 6 weeks documenting her relationship with Sarah Chen. Photos, video, detailed reports. of their meetings, the whole 9 yards. Webb walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. I'll be honest with you, I didn't like the job from the start. Emma Whitfield Blackwood isn't cheating on her husband in the traditional sense. She's in love, has been for years. From what I could tell, there's a difference. He opened the folder and spread out a series of photographs on his desk. They showed Emma and Sarah at various locations around the city. Coffee shops, restaurants, a small apartment that we later learned Sarah had been renting under an assumed name specifically for their meetings. They were careful, Webb continued. Never went to the same place twice in a row, always paid cash, used different routes to get there. But they weren't careful enough. Love makes people sloppy. What was your impression of their relationship? I asked. Webb considered the question carefully. Genuine. Whatever else you might say about the situation, those two women loved each other. You can't fake the kind of connection I documented. The way they looked at each other, the way they touched, that's real emotion, not just physical attraction. Did you report all of this to Richard Blackwood? Every detail, photos, times, locations, everything. He paid me well for thoroughness. And that's what he got. Rosa leaned forward. How did he react when you gave him the report? Webb's expression darkened. That's what bothered me about the whole thing. Most people, when they get confirmation that their spouse is cheating, they're devastated. Angry, hurt, confused, normal human emotions. Blackwood. He was cold as ice. Looked through everything like he was reviewing a business proposal. Asked specific questions about their routine, where they met, how often they saw each other. What kind of specific questions? When they usually met, how long they stayed, whether they had any kind of regular schedule. It felt less like a husband trying to understand his wife's betrayal and more like someone gathering intelligence for something else. I felt a chill run down my spine. Did you get the impression he was planning something? I'm not saying he was planning murder, Webb said carefully. But I've been doing this job long enough to recognize when someone is looking for vulnerabilities, patterns they can exploit. And that's exactly what Richard Blackwood was doing. Webb reached into the folder and pulled out a small digital recorder. There's something else. Blackwood asked me to try to get audio recordings of their conversations. I managed to capture one meeting, about a week before I finished the job. He pressed play, and suddenly the small office was filled with the voices of two women in love, talking quietly in what sounded like a restaurant booth. Emma's voice, I can't keep living this lie, Sarah. It's killing me. Sarah's voice, I know. Baby, but we have to be patient. Once your father's business deal goes through, once Richard gets his judgeship, we can figure out a way to be together openly. Emma, what if we just ran away, left Chicago, started over somewhere else? Sarah, with what money? You know your father would cut you off completely if he found out about us. And Richard, God, Sarah, you don't know what he's capable of. The things he's said to me, the threats he's made. Emma, what kind of threats? Sarah, he said, if I ever tried to take you away from him, he'd make sure I disappeared, that no one would ever find me. He said it with such, coldness, like he was discussing the weather. The recording ended, and the three of us sat in silence for a moment. When was this recorded? I asked. Webb checked his notes. 2 weeks before Sarah Chen was murdered. Asterisk armed with Marcus Webb's evidence and a growing certainty that Richard Blackwood was our killer. Rosa and I returned to his law office. This time, we weren't going as friendly investigators gathering information. We were going to arrest a murderer. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt longer than usual. I checked my service weapon and made sure my handcuffs were easily accessible. Rosa was doing the same, her face set in the grim expression she always wore when we were about to take down a suspect. "You think he'll come quietly?" she asked as we walked through the law firm's marble lobby. "Men like Richard Blackwood don't like to make scenes in public," I replied, too worried about their reputation. "But we need to be ready for anything." The receptionist tried to tell us that Mr. Blackwood was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed, but I showed her my badge and explained that this was police business. Her eyes went wide, and she quickly buzzed us through to the inner offices. Richard's secretary was more of a challenge. She was a stern-looking woman in her 50s who clearly took her job of protecting her boss very seriously. But when I told her we had a warrant for Richard's arrest, she stepped aside and pointed us toward his office. We found Richard Blackwood, exactly where we'd left him the day before, behind his massive desk, looking out at Lake Michigan. But this time, he didn't stand to greet us. He didn't even turn round. "I've been expecting you," he said quietly. "Richard Blackwood," I said, pulling out my handcuffs. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Chen." Now he did turn around, and I was surprised to see that he looked almost relieved. The cold, calculating mask was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like exhaustion. "I suppose Marcus Webb told you about the recording," he said. "Among other things, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "I don't want a lawyer," Richard said, standing up, slowly and placing his hands behind his back. "I want to tell you what really happened." Rosa and I exchanged glances. In my experience, when a suspect wants to confess without a lawyer present, it's usually because they're planning to lie or because the guilt is eating them alive. With Richard Blackwood, I suspected it was a little of both. "You have the right to an attorney," I continued, snapping the handcuffs into place. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. I understand my rights, detective, and I'm waiving them. I want to make a statement." We transported Richard to the precinct and got him settled in interview room 2, a small, windowless space with a metal table, 3 chairs, and a recording device that captured everything said inside. Richard sat calmly, his hands folded in front of him, looking more like a businessman in a meeting than a murder suspect. "Tell us what happened Tuesday night," I said after starting the recording and stating the date, time, and people present. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and controlled. "I followed Sarah Chen home from work that night. I'd been watching her for weeks, learning her routine. I knew Emma was planning to leave me for her. She'd told me as much during our last argument. I couldn't let that happen. So you decided to kill Sarah," Rosa said. "I decided to eliminate the problem," Richard corrected. "Sarah Chen was destroying my life, my career, my future. Everything I'd worked for was going to disappear because my wife couldn't control her. ... urges." The way he said it, with such cold detachment, made my skin crawl. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of temporary insanity. This was premeditated murder, planned and executed with the same precision Richard brought to his business deals. "Walk us through what happened," I said. "I waited until she got home and settled in for the evening. Then I went to the front door and knocked. When she answered, I told her I was Emma's husband and that we needed to talk. She let me in. Probably thought I was there to negotiate some kind of arrangement, and then I told her that Emma had chosen to stay with me, that their relationship was over. She didn't believe me at first, but then I showed her the divorce papers had drawn up. Papers that would have destroyed Emma financially and socially if they'd ever been filed. Richard paused, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that might have been emotion cross his face. She started crying, he continued, begging me not to take Emma away from her, saying they loved each other, that love should matter more than money or reputation. It was ... pathetic. So you shot her, Rosa said flatly. I shot her, Richard confirmed. 1 bullet to the chest. She died quickly. I'm not a monster, detective. I didn't want her to suffer. And the note, for the first time since we'd started the interview, Richard looked confused. What note? I pulled out a copy of the note we'd found in Sarah's hand and slid it across the table. Richard read it, his brow furrowed. I didn't write this, he said. I've never seen this before. Come on, Richard, Rosa said. We know you wrote it. You signed it M to make it look like it came from Emma. But Richard was shaking his head. Detective, I'm confessing to murder. Why would I lie about a note? I didn't write this. I shot Sarah Chen and left immediately. I never wrote any note. I studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception, but everything about his body language and tone suggested he was telling the truth, which meant we had a problem. If Richard Blackwood didn't write the note, who did? After Richard's confession, Rosa and I found ourselves back at square one with the notes. We had our killer. Richard had confessed to the murder, and his story matched the physical evidence. But the note remained a mystery, and something about it nagged at me. I decided to take another look at the crime scene photos, spreading them out on my desk and examining every detail. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. In the photos of Sarah's living room, there was a small table next to where her body was found. On that table was a pen, an expensive-looking fountain pen with gold trim. Rosa, look at this. I called her over. This pen, it's not in the evidence log. She checked the list of items collected from the scene. You're right. The crime scene techs must have missed it. We drove back to Sarah's house, which was still sealed as a crime scene. The pen was exactly where it appeared in the photos. A beautiful Mont Blanc fountain pen that probably cost more than most people spend on a car payment. This is expensive, Rosa observed, carefully bagging the pen. Not the kind of thing Sarah Chen would have just lying around, based on what we know about her lifestyle. Back at the lab, we had the pen tested for fingerprints and DNA. The results came back the next day and changed everything we thought we knew about the case. The pen belonged to Emma Whitfield, but more importantly, when we had a handwriting expert compare the note to samples of Emma's writing, we got a perfect match. Emma had written the note, not Richard. But how was that possible when Richard had killed Sarah? The answer came when we dug deeper into the timeline. Richard had told us he'd killed Sarah sometime between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., but the coroner's more detailed report, which came back that afternoon, narrowed the time of death to between 11:30 p.m. and midnight. Phone records showed that Emma had called Sarah at 11:15 p.m. that night, a call that lasted less than 2 minutes, and Emma's car, which had a GPS tracking system installed by her security-conscious father, showed that she'd left the family estate at 11:20 p.m. and returned at 12:45 a.m. She was there, Rosa said, staring at the timeline we'd constructed. Emma was at Sarah's house when Richard showed up. We brought Emma back in for questioning, this time with her attorney present. She looked even more fragile than before. If that was possible, but there was something different in her eyes, a kind of resigned determination. "Emma," I said gently, "we know you were at Sarah's house Tuesday night. We know you wrote the note. We need you to tell us what really happened." Emma looked at her lawyer, who nodded slightly. Then she took a deep breath and began to speak. "I went to see Sarah that night because I'd made a decision. I was going to leave Richard, leave my family, leave everything behind. I didn't care about the money or the scandal or what people would think. I just wanted to be with the woman I loved." "What happened when you got there?" "Sarah was so happy," Emma said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "We talked about our plans, about where we'd go, how we'd start over. For the first time in years, I felt free. And then Richard arrived." Emma nodded. We heard a knock at the door. Sarah looked through the peephole and saw Richard. She was terrified. She knew he'd been making threats. I told her not to answer, but he kept knocking, saying he just wanted to talk. So she let him in. I hid in the kitchen while they talked. I could hear everything. Richard was so cold, so cruel. He told Sarah that he was going to destroy both of us if she didn't end our relationship. He showed her divorce papers, custody documents that would have taken away any children we might have had together in the future. He'd thought of everything. Emma paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue her lawyer handed her. Sarah tried to reason with him, tried to explain that we loved each other. But Richard, he just laughed. Said love was for children and fools, that the real world was about power and control, and then he shot her, I said softly. Yes, I heard the gunshot, and I ran into the living room. Sarah was on the floor, bleeding. Richard was standing over her with the gun still in his hand. When he saw me, he just smiled. This horrible, cold smile. What did he say? He said, "Now you don't have a choice anymore. You're coming home with me, and we're never going to speak of this again. As far as anyone knows, you were never here, but you didn't go with him." Emma shook her head. "I told him I'd rather die than go anywhere with him." That's when he pointed the gun at me. For a moment, I thought he was going to kill me too. But then he seemed to realize that my death would be harder to explain. So he made me a deal. What kind of deal? He said if I came home with him and never said anything about what happened, he'd make sure the investigation never led back to either of us. He had connections in the police department, he said. People who owed him favors. He could make sure. Sarah's murder looked like a random crime. "But you wrote the note," Rosa said. "After Richard left to get his car from where he'd parked it down the street. I had a few minutes alone with Sarah. She was still alive, barely, but she was trying to tell me something. She kept saying, the basement, I realized. She wanted me to leave some kind of message about what had really happened." Emma's voice broke completely now, and it took her several minutes to compose herself enough to continue. "I wrote the note with my pen, the one Richard had given me for our first anniversary. I wanted to leave some kind of trail, some way for the truth to come out eventually. I put it in Sarah's hand and hoped that someday someone would understand what it meant." "Why didn't you go to the police immediately?" I asked. "Because I was terrified," Emma whispered. "Richard had just murdered the woman I loved in cold blood, and he'd threatened to kill me too if I said anything. I knew he had powerful friends, connections that could make evidence disappear or investigations go away. I was afraid no one would believe me, and now—" Emma looked up at me with eyes that held more pain than anyone should have to bear. "Now I don't care what happens to me. Sarah is dead, and Richard is going to pay for what he did. That's all that matters. The trial of Richard Blackwood became one of the most closely watched cases in Chicago that year. The combination of wealth, power, forbidden love, and cold-blooded murder captured the public's imagination in a way that few cases do. Richard's defense team, led by one of the city's most expensive criminal attorneys, tried to argue that the killing was a crime of passion, that Richard had discovered his wife's affair and acted in a moment of temporary insanity. But the evidence told a different story. The weeks of surveillance, the careful planning, the cold calculation with which he'd executed the murder, all of it pointed to premeditation. Emma's testimony was the most powerful moment of the trial. Dressed in a simple black dress, looking fragile but determined, she told the jury exactly what had happened that night. Her voice never wavered as she described watching the man she was married to murder the woman she loved. Richard Blackwood didn't kill Sarah Chen in a moment of passion, she said, looking directly at the jury. He killed her because she represented something he couldn't control. Love, real, genuine love that couldn't be bought or manipulated or destroyed by threats and intimidation. The defense attorney tried to discredit Emma's testimony, suggesting that she was an unreliable witness due to her mental health issues and her obvious bias against the defendant. But the physical evidence supported her story completely. The timeline, the note, the pen, everything confirmed that Emma had been present during the murder and that Richard had acted with premeditation. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, painted a picture of Richard Blackwood as a man who saw people as objects to be controlled and manipulated. When he couldn't control Sarah Chen, when she threatened to take away something he considered his property, his wife, he eliminated her with the same cold efficiency he brought to his business deals. This wasn't a crime of passion, Walsh told the jury during her closing argument. This was an execution. Richard Blackwood planned Sarah Chen's murder with the same attention to detail he used to plan corporate mergers. The only difference was that, instead of acquiring a company, he was eliminating a person who stood in the way of what he wanted. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and intimidation of a witness. Richard Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, I watched Richard's face carefully. Even then, even as his life was being destroyed by the consequences of his actions, he showed no emotion, no remorse, no anger, no fear, just the same cold calculation that had led him to murder an innocent woman. Emma, on the other hand, broke down completely when the verdict was announced. Not from relief or satisfaction, but from the overwhelming grief that she'd been carrying since Sarah's death. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back the woman she loved. 6 months after Richard Blackwood's conviction, I found myself standing in Graceland Cemetery on a grey October morning, watching Emma Whitfield place a bouquet of white roses on Sarah Chen's grave. It had become a weekly ritual for her, one of the few things that seemed to bring her any peace. Emma had divorced Richard while he was awaiting trial, and her father had surprisingly stood by her throughout the ordeal. Charles Whitfield, it turned out, had known about his daughter's relationship with Sarah for years and had been quietly hoping she would find the courage to live her truth. The family's wealth and social standing had taken a hit from the scandal, but they'd weathered it better than anyone expected. Detective Sullivan, Emma said as I approached. She looked healthier than she had during the trial. She'd gained some weight, and there was color in her cheeks again, but the sadness in her eyes remained. "How are you holding up?" I asked. Some days are better than others, she said honestly. I'm in therapy now, trying to work through the guilt and the grief. Dr. Martinez says it's going to take time. Survivors. Guilt is common in situations like this, I said. You can't blame yourself for what Richard did. Emma was quiet for a moment, staring at Sarah's headstone. I keep thinking about all the time we wasted, all the years we could have been together if I'd been braver. If I'd been willing to face the truth about who I am instead of living a lie. You were protecting yourself, I said, and protecting Sarah in your own way. You couldn't have known what Richard was capable of, couldn't I? Emma turned to look at me, and I saw a flicker of the old pain in her eyes. There were signs, detective, the way he controlled every aspect of my life, the threats he made, the violence that was always just under the surface. I knew he was dangerous, but I thought I could manage him. I thought I could keep Sarah safe by keeping our relationship secret. Secrets have a way of becoming dangerous, I said. I've learned that in my years on the force, the things we hide, the truths we're afraid to face, they have a way of destroying us in the end. Emma nodded. Sarah used to say that love shouldn't have to hide in the shadows. She was right. If we'd been open about our relationship from the beginning, if I'd had the courage to live honestly, maybe she'd still be alive. Or maybe Richard would have killed you both, I said gently. You can't know what might have happened, Emma. You can only control what happens next. She smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since this whole nightmare began. Sarah would have liked you, detective. She always said the world needed more people who cared about justice, not just law and order. I wish I could have met her under different circumstances. She was the best person I've ever known, Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. Kind, funny, passionate about everything she cared about. She volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend, you know. She said animals were honest in a way that people often weren't. They loved unconditionally, without judgment or expectations. We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Emma spoke again. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, she said. Something to help LGBTQ+ youth who are struggling with family acceptance, who are afraid to live their truth. I want to use my family's resources to make sure other people don't have to hide the way Sarah and I did. That sounds like something Sarah would have supported. She would have loved it, Emma agreed. She always said that our love story shouldn't be a tragedy, that it should inspire other people to be brave enough to live authentically. I want to honor that. I want to make sure her death means something. As I walked away from the cemetery, that day I couldn't help but think about the price of secrets. Sarah Chen had died because she'd fallen in love with someone who was trapped in a life of lies and expectations. Emma Whitfield had lost the love of her life because she'd been too afraid to live her truth. And Richard Blackwood had destroyed his own life and taken an innocent one because he couldn't accept that love, real, genuine love, can't be controlled or manipulated or destroyed by threats and intimidation. In my 23 years as a detective, I've seen a lot of cases that stayed with me long after the files were closed. But this one changed me. It reminded me that behind every crime, there are human beings with hopes and dreams and fears. It showed me that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones we keep from ourselves. And it taught me that love, even when it's hidden in the shadows, even when it's forbidden or complicated or tragic, is still the most powerful force in the world. Sarah Chen and Emma Whitfield's love story may have ended in tragedy, but it also ended